My name is Eleanor Hart, and on the day of my grandfather's funeral, I learned that sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. That was the day I discovered the truth about love betrayal and the quiet legacy a man can leave behind when the rest of the world is scrambling for what shines. Grandpa wasn't just a man to me, he was a presence, a towering figure with shoulders shaped like they once carried the weight of whole nations. I grew up calling him Grandpa, but everyone outside the family called him General Hart. They said it with respect, reverence, and a touch of fear. He had one of those reputations, the kind that stretches far beyond the house, far beyond the years. If you asked anyone in our town in North Carolina, they'd tell you General Hart was the kind of man who stood when others shrank, who spoke softly but decisively, whose word meant something. He lived through real wars, saw real sacrifice, and understood the cost of duty in a way the rest of us only read about. I spent so many childhood summers with him, early mornings on the back porch, where mist rose off the fields, like old ghosts waking up fishing trips, where he'd teach me more about patience than about catching anything, and long evenings where he'd speak in the rhythm of memory. Sometimes he'd say, "Ellie girl, the hardest battles aren't fought with bullets but with choices." He said it often enough that the words tattooed themselves onto my bones. My parents were different, almost comically so. They were consumers. They believed in exterior things, cars, titles, beachfront rentals, vacations that were more about posting than peace. To them, Grandpa was a vault of potential wealth. To me, he was a compass. The funeral was held at the old stone church with the white steeple, one of those classic American small-town churches, where the wooden pews creak and the stained glass windows make the light look like prayer. Veterans lined the sidewalk outside, old men with berets and medals, some leaning on canes, others standing impossibly straight despite their age. People over 60 know that sight well, the quiet fraternity of those who served. Inside, I sat between my parents, or rather next to them, because emotionally there was a gulf. My father's expression was business-like, calculating. I could almost hear the inventory in his head. My mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, although I'm not sure she was crying from grief. More likely it was the dust or theatrics. When the service ended, we moved to the lawyer's office, mahogany furniture framed diplomas, old-world seriousness. Grandpa had chosen a lawyer with spine, Walter Brooks, now in his 70s, white-haired, dignified, with eyes like ice water. When he spoke, it was slow and intentional, as if every word had been vetted for truth. He began with the formalities, the legalities, the distributions. To Mr. and Mrs. Hart, he said, gesturing toward my parents, "You are to receive the Hart family residence, the financial accounts associated with the estate, and all related assets." My mother exhaled in relief. My father smiled at the exact same moment. Their hands curled together like two vines twisting around treasure. Then Walter turned to me. "And to Eleanor Hart," he said. My breath stalled. He held up a simple white envelope. No embossing, no seal, just my name. It weighed nothing and everything. I took it gently, like it might crumble. Inside was a one-way plane ticket to London. That was it. My father snorted, actually snorted. Then he said loud enough to make the moment public. "Well, looks like the old man never cared for you as much as you thought." I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anyone. I only stared at that strange ticket. Why London? Why one way? Why me? Walter Brooks cleared his throat, his voice solemn. "Eleanor, your grandfather requested you open the envelope privately and accept his final direction without judgment. He was quite insistent." Something flickered in his eyes, sympathy, concern, respect, I couldn't tell. As we left, my parents swept ahead, already talking about renovations, market value, rental potential. I lagged behind, walking slowly, letting their voices fade. When I was younger, Grandpa would place his hand over mine whenever I worried about the future. I used to think he was stabilizing me. Only later did I realize he was steadying himself too. That night I packed. Not much, just practical clothes, a photo of Grandpa and me at the lake, and the pocket knife he once gave me for emergencies. My ticket was for 9:35 a.m. the next morning. At breakfast, my father tried one last jab. "You could stay, you know. Get a job here, make a life. England isn't home." I didn't look at him as I answered. "I'm going to follow what Grandpa intended." He made an ugly sound in his throat and muttered, He never really loved you. That was the last thing he said to me before I left. But here's the thing, people over 60 know this deeply. Love isn't proven by what you receive. It's proven by what you carry forward. The plane hummed beneath me for the 7-hour flight, the white noise like a lullaby. I didn't sleep. I just kept hearing Grandpa's voice in my memory. If you ever find yourself standing at a crossroads, choose the harder road. It leads somewhere worth going. When the plane descended over the gray sprawl of Greater London, I felt a strange calm. A homesickness for a home I hadn't yet discovered. I moved through the terminal dazed but purposeful. Then I saw him. A man in impeccable attire, dark uniform, polished shoes, posture like a royal guard. He held a placard with a single word. Heart. I approached slowly. He actually bowed and said, "Ma'am, the Queen is waiting." The word struck me like thunder. And that was the moment I understood the dead do speak if you're willing to listen. I didn't know what to say at first. Shock has a way of freezing the tongue while speeding up the mind. It was as if time itself paused between each heartbeat. The driver waited patiently, not looking at me with curiosity or pity, but with professional composure. Old Americans know that kind of bearing instantly. It's military or ceremonial. Earned, not worn. I finally managed this must be a mistake. He didn't waver. "No mistake, ma'am." Outside, a sleek black vehicle waited, not ostentatious but dignified. The air was cold and damp in that distinctly British way, and I pulled my coat tighter. I entered the car with a mix of confusion and reluctant acceptance. As we moved through London, my thoughts churned. I glanced at the driver in the rearview mirror. "How did you know I was coming?" He replied, "Your grandfather made these arrangements. A long time ago." A long time ago, those words vibrated. Grandpa had known, he had planned, he had intended. I tried to ask more questions, but each one seemed to unravel into something deeper. "Did you know him?" I asked. The driver paused. "Not personally, but my superior did," and spoke of him with great admiration. Admiration, not money, not property, admiration. The car glided past landmarks older than the country I'd left behind. Big Ben, the Thames bridges layered with history. I watched them through the window like someone passing through a story rather than a city. During the flight, I'd had time, hours of it, to sift through memories of Grandpa. I remembered once asking him why he never boasted about his achievements. Other veterans talked, some bragged, some embellished. But Grandpa only spoke about service, not glory. He told me honor doesn't echo loud, it echoes long. I didn't fully understand then. I did now. At one point, I asked the driver quietly, "Where are we going?" "To someone who can answer your questions," he replied, "and who knew your grandfather's true work." When he said true work, something inside me tightened. All these years, had Grandpa been carrying something unseen? We eventually arrived at a private estate, not Buckingham, not anything public. This was discreet, almost intentionally unremarkable. The kind of place you only know exists if someone invites you. The gates opened silently. The car crept forward down a gravel drive lined with bare trees that looked like silver bones in the winter fog. My heart hammered, but I sat straighter. If Grandpa sent me here, I would face it with his kind of spine. Inside the estate, everything was restrained elegance, polished wood portraits of dignified faces, soft lighting. We were met by a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing a tailored navy suit. She spoke warmly. "Welcome, Miss Hart. We've been expecting you." Expecting me. The words held both reassurance and mystery. She introduced herself as Lady Catherine Ward, an advisor of sorts. Not an official title, but an influential one. She guided me to a sitting room with 2 chairs and a small table between them. A tea service waited untouched. Americans over 60 know the ritual of tea and conversation, the pace of respect. Lady Catherine began gently. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man. His role in certain international matters was instrumental." "I know he served," I replied, "but I don't know details. He didn't talk much about his work." "Because humility was in his nature," she said. "But what he accomplished, especially in cooperation with our government, will not be forgotten." She leaned forward. "He helped avert a diplomatic crisis in the late 1980s. His counsel prevented what could have become a dangerous escalation between our nations. I blinked. Grandpa. She nodded. Yes. Behind the scenes. Quietly. He believed in peace achieved through respect, not intimidation. It took time for the weight of that to settle. Grandpa, the man who taught me to skip stones, had also been a safeguard against conflict. Lady Catherine's tone softened even further. He left something for you, something personal. She handed me a leather-bound bundle, documents, letters, photos. My hands trembled as I untied the string. On top was a handwritten note in Grandpa's unmistakable script. Ellie girl, if you are reading this, I trusted you with what matters most. You have heart steadiness and the ability to listen to people and to silence. Follow where this leads, and you will understand. Grandpa. I held the page to my chest. The scent of graphite and age clung to the words. Lady Catherine allowed a respectful pause. There is more you will come to learn. But for now, trust in the fact that your grandfather loved you enough to choose you as the bearer of these truths. Not my parents, not the heirs of property, me. I wasn't given wealth, I was given responsibility. Later that night, alone in the guest room overlooking a courtyard of frozen fountains, I read through Grandpa's letters, each one deepening the realization that he had groomed me not to inherit comfort, but purpose. In one he wrote, "People chase riches because they don't know that real wealth is influence used for good. You understand that instinctively. That is why you were chosen." I finally understood the ticket. London wasn't a destination, it was a summons. As I drifted toward sleep, I whispered to the memory of him. I'll follow this through, Grandpa, I promise. And outside, beyond the glass, the old city exhaled a cold mist into the night like a quiet agreement. I woke the next morning with a surprising sense of clarity, as though the fog that had accompanied me from America had finally begun to thin. Lady Catherine had arranged for a light breakfast, but I barely touched it. My real nourishment lay in the letters I continued to read, each one revealing a deeper layer of Grandpa's hidden life. If Part 2 was about arrival, Part 3 was about revelation. Lady Catherine returned mid-morning and found me with the letters spread across the table. She smiled softly, recognizing the expression on my face, the look of someone beginning to see the larger map from a once fragmented puzzle. She took a seat across from me. "You're absorbing quickly," she said. "I'm trying," I replied. I never imagined he carried so much, and alone." She nodded. Responsibility of that magnitude is rarely understood by the many, it is carried by the few. I folded one of the letters carefully. "Am I allowed to ask questions? Or are there things still off limits?" "You may ask," she said, "and I will answer what I can." So I asked the question weighing most heavily in my mind. What exactly did he do? Lady Catherine stood and moved to a cabinet, retrieving a thin leather file. She handed it to me. Inside were declassified summaries of diplomatic communications between US and UK officials. Some names I recognized from history books. Others were unknown to me. Lady Catherine began slowly with a measured tone. In the late 1980s, there was a destabilizing event, a misunderstanding between our governments. Your grandfather was part of a special advisory circle, a channel of trust between leadership across borders. I studied a highlighted passage, tracing the words with my fingertip. He was chosen because he valued peace above ego, she said. Because he was pragmatic, calm, rational. And loyal, I added. Yes, she agreed, loyal. But not blindly so. He was loyal to principles more than personalities. I took a breath. And he never talked about this. No, she said, not even to your father. I let that settle. It struck me then that Grandpa hadn't been secretive to exclude, he had been protective. Lady Catherine continued. Your grandfather held influence in quiet rooms where loud voices would have been counterproductive. His calm temperament was exactly the antidote needed in times of tension. I felt a ripple of pride beneath my skin, warm and old and familiar. He had done it. He had truly served something higher. But then the other realization struck: he had chosen to share none of this with the ones who inherited his property. I finally asked, why me? Lady Catherine regarded me thoughtfully. Because you listened to him, not just heard him. He trusted your instincts. He saw in you the ability to weigh a moment before reacting to it. She paused. Your parents did not share that temperament. I nearly laughed, but it came out sadder than intended. She was gentle but honest. They are not bad people, just people for whom legacy is measured in visible assets. I nodded slowly. It was hard to argue. Lady Catherine shifted the conversation. Your grandfather's legacy includes something else, something living. She handed me a list of names, organizations, contacts, community networks, support groups for veterans and their families. I read the heading aloud, The Heart Foundation. Yes, she replied. Named not for your family but for the quality of heart, she explained. Decades ago, Grandpa had begun quietly funding programs that helped retired military personnel transition back into civilian life. Education stipends, job placement systems, psychological support networks, housing stability initiatives. And nowhere, not on any document, any website, any plaque, did his name appear as the benefactor. He had helped anonymously. I felt my throat tighten. Lady Catherine continued. Many veterans owe their current well-being to his intervention. And now, that responsibility passes to you. My heart began to beat harder, not out of fear but of purpose awakening. But I don't know how to run a foundation, I said. You will learn, she replied, and you won't do it alone. As if summoned by fate itself, there was a soft knock at the door. A man entered, mid-70s, crisp posture, eyes clear despite age. He wore a simple suit with a small American flag pin. This is Colonel James Whitmore, Lady Catherine said. Retired U.S. Army liaison. He worked closely with your grandfather. He extended his hand and I rose to shake it. His grip was firm, steady. He spoke in a voice weathered but strong. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever served with. He spared many young men from going into situations they were not prepared for. He saved lives not with weaponry, but with wisdom. I swallowed. I don't know if I can measure up to him. He shook his head. You don't need to be him. You just need to carry forward the values he believed in. We sat together for the next 2 hours. He shared stories, not classified ones, but human ones. Stories of a young soldier whose life turned around after Grandpa arranged for him to get proper education. Stories of a struggling veteran family who received housing assistance in their lowest moment. Stories of Grandpa visiting rehab centers, sitting silently beside wounded men just to offer presence, not platitudes. It was the smallness of Grandpa's service that moved me. The humility, the invisibility. It was never about applause. It was about dignity. At one point, Colonel Whitmore placed his hand briefly over mine and said, He chose you because you already lived the way he believed a person should. You don't need wealth. You don't need recognition. You need only to remember who you are. I closed my eyes. At that moment, I didn't feel pressure. I felt alignment. That evening in solitude, I reread Grandpa's last personal letter. Ellie girl. If the world tries to measure you by possession, let them. You measure by impact. That will be your true inheritance. I pressed the letter to my heart again. And I whispered into the quiet room. I'll do it, Grandpa. I'll continue your work. Outside London lay in calm silence, and somewhere in that distance I felt a presence Grandpa's no longer heavy with secrets, but light with release. I understood then that his death wasn't the end of his influence. It was the shifting of the torch. And it burned in me. The next morning when I woke up, something had changed in me. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A quiet resolve had settled where confusion once lived. I was no longer just reacting to what was placed before me. I was beginning to step forward intentionally, as though Grandpa's letters had lit a trail where there had once been fog. Lady Catherine suggested that I take a walk through the estate gardens to clear my head before the next stage of revelations. The winter air was crisp, the grass frosted in crystalline layers. I walked slowly, breathing deeply, hearing the crunch beneath my boots. It was grounding, real. When I returned inside, Colonel Whitmore was waiting for me with a coffee mug in his hand. He looked like a man who had seen the world change more than once and had learned to adapt rather than resist. He handed me a second mug, and we sat by the tall window overlooking the courtyard. Today, he said, you will receive the final part of what your grandfather intended to pass to you. I nodded, though a part of me still felt unworthy. Colonel Whitmore seemed to sense it. "You're ready," he added gently, "because you lead with heart first." That phrase, heart first, had never felt more fitting. Lady Catherine soon called us into a room I hadn't entered before. It was smaller, cozier, lined with books, maps, and a single framed photograph of Grandpa standing beside a smiling British officer. They both wore plain uniforms, unadorned, relaxed, like two men sharing trust rather than protocol. On the desk lay two folders, one blue, one maroon. Lady Catherine gestured toward the blue one. "This is about the foundation, your role, your access, your ability to make decisions." She paused. "It names you as the successor." I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents transferring executive stewardship of the Heart Foundation to me, not just symbolically but operationally. There was also a letter of introduction written by Grandpa to contacts within various veteran organizations. I traced the signature slowly. His penmanship carried the weight of command and the tenderness of family. Colonel Whitmore leaned forward. "That means you can make grants, determine resource allocations, meet with organizations as his representative, and decide on future directions." I exhaled. "That's an enormous responsibility." "And that is why he chose someone capable," Lady Catherine reassured. Then she gestured to the maroon folder. "This is the personal inheritance, the one that explains the why." I opened it, expecting numbers, property deeds, perhaps some hidden wealth. What I found instead were journals. Grandpa's journals. Pages and pages of handwritten reflections, the kind meant for no eyes, but those he trusted explicitly. The first entry was dated 1991. "I have money, yes, but it belongs in circulation, not in captivity. It should move through the world like blood, not sit in vaults like stone." My eyes welled. Another entry. "If I left property to your father, it is because he understands property. If I left responsibility to you, it is because you understand people." I felt tears slowly begin to spill, but I didn't wipe them away. They were not the ashamed kind. They were recognition. Then there was a page titled simply, "Legacy." Under it, his writing flowed carefully. "Legacy is not measured in square footage or bank statements. Legacy is measured in lives bettered, burdens eased, and dignity restored. If you understand that, then you understand me." I looked up from the page. Lady Catherine was quiet, allowing me to absorb. Colonel Whitmore spoke softly. "He wasn't denying you wealth, he was offering you purpose. And purpose lasts longer than any estate." I nodded, but I needed air. I thanked them both and stepped outside into the cold again, holding one of the journals to my chest like a relic. I walked the perimeter of the estate, letting the cold bite into my skin like a clarifier of thoughts. And somewhere in that silent walk, I began to understand something crucial. I was not being cheated, I was being chosen. When I re-entered the estate, I was more grounded than ever. Lady Catherine then showed me one last item, a small brass key. "This unlocks the United States-based account designated for the foundation. Your grandfather established it long ago. The funds are not for personal use, but their size will allow you to sustain the mission." I blinked. "How much is in it?" She didn't name a number directly, just said enough to change lives. And somehow, that was better than knowing the figure. Later that afternoon, sitting with both of them in quiet dialogue, we began discussing tangible steps. They didn't dictate, they advised. The decisions remained mine. I asked, "Why didn't Grandpa ever talk about this?" "Not even to me." Colonel Whitmore answered thoughtfully. "Because some responsibilities must reveal themselves in their own time. He didn't want to influence you prematurely. He wanted you to be ready." Lady Catherine added, "Your grandfather understood something rare. Guidance is not control. He trusted your growth." When the sun began to set, we shared a simple dinner soup bread quiet conversation. In between dialogue, there were pauses that older Americans know well, the comfortable silences of people who respect one another. Before bed, I returned to the journals, and in one of the final entries, I found words that pierced me. "Ellie girl, when the time comes, do not look back in resentment at your parents. They are limited by what they believe matters. You are liberated by what truly matters. Let compassion be your quiet victory." I closed the journal, and for the first time since his funeral, I smiled more than I cried. I whispered into the dimly lit room. I get it now, Grandpa, and I'll carry it forward. That night, I slept deeply like someone who finally understood the map she had been given. The next few weeks were a blur of movement, preparation, and transformation. I returned to the United States not in shame or confusion, but with a sense of direction I had never known before. Leaving London, I carried Grandpa's journals, that brass key contacts who trusted me, and above all, clarity. Back home in North Carolina, I didn't go to my parents' house. I rented a modest apartment near the heart of town. I chose a place close to regular working families, teachers, retirees, young couples starting out, not near gated communities or ocean view condominiums where my parents spent their time. I wanted to be among real people. Within days, I contacted each veteran support organization in Grandpa's list. My first meetings were with local veterans who had quietly suffered through decades of neglect or invisibility. I listened to their stories. A man who had served 2 tours and returned to find that the world had moved on without him. A woman who fought through PTSD while trying to be a single mother. A retired medic who had saved lives overseas and then struggled to find purpose back home. I brought nothing flashy, no film crews, no announcements, just presence. One of the first veterans I met, a quiet man named Frank, told me something I'll never forget. He said, "People think we want parades. We don't want parades. We want to be seen." Being seen. Grandpa had understood that deeply. I began personally reviewing funding requests. Instead of rubber stamping grants, I visited facilities myself, shaking hands, asking questions, speaking face to face. Every time I did, I felt Grandpa beside me, nodding silently. Soon, word began to spread not through headlines but through phone calls, handshakes, and word of mouth. People began to know that the Heart Foundation wasn't just writing checks, it was showing up. I formed a council of advisors, retired colonels, therapists, program organizers, ministers, community advocates. The meetings were held in modest community center rooms, not boardrooms. We used metal folding chairs, old coffee makers, and whiteboards with handwritten notes. It felt honest. And slowly I started to grow into leadership not by assertion, but by alignment. One evening after a particularly productive meeting, a woman named Carol, a Navy veteran and widowed grandmother, pulled me aside. "You're different," she said. "You're not doing this for credit." I answered simply, "I'm doing it for legacy." She placed a hand over mine the same way Grandpa used to and whispered, "Your grandfather would be proud." Sometimes the biggest reward is being told something you already hoped was true. As the Foundation's reputation grew, so did its impact. Programs expanded, partnerships strengthened. Veterans and their families began receiving real lasting help, job retraining, housing assistance, therapy services, educational grants. Meanwhile, my parents began to notice. At first, they ignored it. They assumed it was a little hobby. Then, as newspapers began writing pieces about the revitalized Heart Foundation and how it was making tangible change, their tone changed. I received a call from my mother one afternoon. "So," she said, trying to sound casual, "I hear you're keeping busy with Grandpa's little foundation." Little foundation. I didn't bother correcting her. I simply replied, "I'm doing what he wanted." She sighed dramatically. "Well, I hope you're being practical about it. Money can run out, you know." Money wasn't running out. It was moving just like Grandpa intended. A week later, I went to a small gathering hosted by one of our partner organizations. Veterans of all ages were there, young and old men and women, all sharing stories of resilience. There were tears, laughter, pats on the back, and quiet moments of reflection. During the event, an elderly veteran, maybe in his late 80s, stood and spoke. His voice quavered like an old radio signal, but his words were clear. "Your grandfather helped me when I thought God had forgotten me. And now, you're helping others. You have his eyes, child. You have his steadiness." People over 60 in the room nodded with the kind of knowing emotion that comes only from lived decades. I felt something deep and ancient settle inside me. Not pride, something quieter, something earned. As weeks turned into months, I became closely involved at every level. I traveled to other states, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, meeting local leaders and hearing veterans' needs firsthand. Sometimes I slept in modest motels. Sometimes I stayed as a guest in someone's spare bedroom. I never asked for special treatment. Everywhere I went, I carried Grandpa's journals. His words were a compass. In one entry, he wrote, "If ever you feel lost, remember that service is the surest direction home." Home, not house, home. By now, my parents' attitude began to shift from skepticism to concern. They saw a movement they couldn't control, one that didn't need them, and perhaps most painfully, one that, for the first time, had no interest in their approval. One evening after returning from a long trip, I visited the local cemetery. I brought fresh flowers, white gardenias, Grandpa's favorite. As I placed them on his grave, I rested my palm against the cool stone. "I think I'm beginning to understand," I whispered. And in that moment, I didn't feel alone. I felt connected to him, to his legacy, and to every life touched by the work he began. I straightened up, breathing deeply, and made a silent vow. "I won't let your legacy fade. I'll build on it." I walked away that night, not with sorrow, but with purpose humming through my bones. And somewhere in the stillness of the cemetery, among the quiet resting places of many souls, I imagined Grandpa standing there, his hat in hand, his smile warm, his voice steady. "That's my girl." As word of the Foundation's resurrection spread, so too did whispers of resentment from my parents. Their irritation grew into suspicion, and suspicion fermented into bitterness. They had inherited physical wealth, but they were suddenly being overshadowed by the daughter who had inherited something less tangible but far more powerful: respect. One gray afternoon, I received a formal letter delivered by courier. Inside was an official notice my parents were contesting the will. They were claiming that Grandpa had been mentally unfit, manipulated, emotionally biased, and that I had coerced him into giving me the Foundation leadership. It was absurd. I laughed once, a dry, humorless sound, then set the letter down. The next morning, another letter arrived, this one from the court. A date had been set for probate litigation. I knew then the quiet work of legacy was about to collide with the noisy work of greed. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I gathered documentation: Grandpa's letters, financial records, legal filings, the original will testimony from Colonel Whitmore and Lady Catherine, and even statements from beneficiaries of the Foundation. Not to weaponize, but to clarify. The courthouse on the morning of the trial was full not of spectators but of presences. Veterans filled the hallway, some in old uniforms, some in plain clothes. They weren't there to protest, they were there to stand. Quietly, solidly. I entered with calm steps, wearing a simple navy dress. No jewelry, hair pulled back, no spectacle. My parents arrived fashionably late, dressed as though for a business gala. My father wore an expensive suit. My mother wore pearls and perfume that arrived before she did. Their attorney was a man who spoke loudly and confidently, maybe thinking volume was the same as argument. Inside the courtroom, the judge was an older woman with steel gray hair and an expression that revealed nothing. She called the hearing to order. My parents' attorney began dramatically claiming that Grandpa's mental acuity had diminished in his final year, that he had been emotionally manipulated, that I had isolated him and influenced him. I sat still, composed. I did not interrupt. When it was our turn, my attorney, a modest, soft-spoken woman named Deborah, stood and simply said, "Let us hear General Hart's voice, not ours." She read aloud from Grandpa's journals, each word like a hammer against falsehood. "If I left responsibility to Eleanor, it is because she has heart. She understands people, not possessions. To my son, wealth would not have bettered your character. Responsibility might have broken it." In the courtroom there was a shift like air redistributing. My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked wounded not by injustice but by embarrassment. Deborah then called Colonel Whitmore to the stand. He walked with measured steps. When sworn in, he spoke firmly. General Hart was in full command of his faculties. He made decisions carefully, and he told me personally that his granddaughter was the only one he trusted with the continuation of his mission. The judge listened without expression. Then something happened that I did not expect. Frank, the quiet veteran I had met early in my return, stood from the gallery and respectfully requested to speak. The judge allowed it. He walked slowly to the witness stand and faced the court. "I owe my life to the Hart Foundation," he said. "General Hart helped me when I was lost. And Eleanor here, she continued that help. She shows up, she listens, she cares." His voice thickened. Taking this legacy from her is not just wrong, it dishonors the man you're here talking about." He returned to his seat. Every step sounded like punctuation. The judge finally spoke. "I have read the will, the journals, and the financial statements. I have reviewed the testimony, and I see no evidence of coercion, only intention." She looked directly at my parents. "What I see here is not injustice against you, but disappointment that you did not receive more." There was a long pause. Older listeners know the potency of a judge's silence. The judge then said, "The will stands. Eleanor Hart is the rightful inheritor of all responsibilities designated to her, including leadership of the foundation." She banged the gavel once. It was over. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters tried to swarm, but I walked straight through, not with defiance but with purpose. Veterans made a quiet corridor for me, nodding as I passed. My parents emerged later, angry, deflated. My father caught up to me in the parking lot. His voice was sharp. "You stole my inheritance." I turned slowly, meeting his eyes with calm. "No," I said. "You inherited exactly what Grandpa knew you valued. Property, money. I inherited what he valued, legacy." For a moment his expression flickered, not with fury but with something else. Something vulnerable. Something like regret. My mother looked at me with damp eyes, not from grief but from realization. And in that moment I felt a strange pang, not triumph, but sorrow. Because Grandpa had seen them clearly, but they had not seen themselves. I softened my tone. "Dad, you still can be part of something meaningful. If you want to, you're welcome to help, not to control, not to claim, but to serve." He blinked, stunned. Perhaps decades of pride cracked just a little. Then I turned and walked away, not as a victor, but as a steward. That night, after the courthouse and the confrontation and the painful clarity, I returned to my apartment and sat by the window. The world outside was quiet. Normal. I opened Grandpa's journal to a random page, and the sentence there was almost eerie in its timeliness. "Victory measured by humiliation is shallow. Victory measured by healing is profound." I closed the journal gently. And I realized then that the courtroom battle had not been the true confrontation. The true confrontation was between who my family had been and who they might become. In the weeks following the courtroom ruling, life began to settle into a different rhythm. There was no eruption of celebration, no victory parade, just quiet continuity. The foundation resumed its work, and I returned to meeting with veterans, reviewing programs, and shaping the path forward with a steadier hand and a lighter heart. Yet one thing lingered, the unresolved tension with my parents. It was around mid-spring when I received a call from my mother. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Not weak, just quieter. "Your father isn't doing well," she said. "He's deflated." I let silence stretch for a moment, then replied, "I'll come by." Their house felt different that day. Less like a fortress of possessions, and more like a place holding ghosts of intention. My father was in the den staring at an old family photo, one with Grandpa me as a child, sitting on his knee and my parents standing behind us. He didn't turn when I entered. For a moment I wasn't sure he knew I was there. Then he spoke. "I always thought Dad loved you more," he said quietly. I inhaled slowly. He loved us differently. He nodded, and I suppose I envied that. I sat beside him, not too close, not too far. "He didn't love you less," I said. "He just didn't know how to reach you." My father's voice trembled just a little. "I thought the money meant he trusted me, that he believed in me." "He did," I replied gently. "He trusted you to do what you do best, manage property, maintain assets. He gave you what fit your strengths. He gave me what fit mine." My father swallowed hard. All these years I thought he was withholding something from me, when really I was blind to what I already had. We sat in the kind of silence older Americans know deeply, the silence not of avoidance but of acceptance. My mother entered then, carrying tea. She set the cups down but didn't leave. Instead, she settled across from us. She looked at me with eyes softer than I'd ever seen from her. I was so angry, she confessed, because I felt judged, passed over. But I realize now, I was measuring love in the wrong currency. I nodded slowly. It's not too late to measure differently. We talked for hours that day, not about money, not about the trial, but about Grandpa, about memories, regrets, misunderstandings. And somewhere in the middle of that long conversation, something shifted. Not a grand reconciliation, nothing that dramatic, just thawing. By early summer, I invited my parents to visit one of the veteran housing projects the foundation was funding. At first, they stood on the edges, not sure what to do. But then a retired Marine named Charles approached my father, shook his hand, and said, "Your dad helped me when I was at my lowest. Your daughter is doing the same. You must be proud." My father blinked, then replied, I am. Something unknotted in him then. I saw it in the way he began speaking less about property taxes and more about people, how he asked questions not about assets, but about lives. My mother found her place too. She started volunteering, helping with care packages, writing letters of encouragement, coordinating community drives. And in doing so, she discovered something that surprised her. She had empathy, real empathy. It had simply been dormant, buried beneath layers of status and social posturing. One afternoon, she pulled me aside. "I didn't know I could be useful," she said. "You're more than useful," I replied. "You're needed." She squeezed my hand with tears shining in her eyes. Through the months that followed, we began rebuilding not a fairy tale reconciliation, but an honest one. We still disagreed sometimes. We still saw the world differently. But now we began from respect instead of rivalry. As for me, I continued leading the foundation not with the weight of obligation, but with the warmth of calling. I visited hospitals, spoke at small-town fundraisers, drank weak coffee in VFW halls, alongside men and women who had earned those quiet rooms. I wasn't Eleanor the inheritor. I was Eleanor the listener, Eleanor the builder, Eleanor the granddaughter of a man who measured worth by service. One late autumn evening, I returned to the cemetery again. The air was cool, leaves rustling like whispers of old conversations. I knelt before Grandpa's grave and told him everything about the foundation, about Dad's softening, about Mom's emerging compassion. And then I thanked him not for giving me purpose, but for trusting that I could grow into it. Before I stood up, I whispered, "I'll keep doing this, as long as I can, until the good outlives me too." Walking back through the dusk, I felt no rage, no triumph, no lingering resentment, only gratitude for legacy, for love, for the kind of justice that heals, not harms. And so I speak now to whoever listens to stories like these. The greatest inheritance is not what we hold in our hands, but what we carry in our hearts. If you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued or measured by the wrong yardstick, know this. Your worth isn't dictated by what others see. It's shaped by what you choose to give, to build, to honor. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched you, I invite you to share it or follow for more. Sometimes the world needs reminders of quiet legacies, the ones that ripple through lives unseen.